And we are live on Amazon. Seems to work again, which is good. So, welcome to the show, Nick. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And I think you've written one book so far. Is that true?
That's right. Yes. I am now working on my second book, but I've so far written one book. Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And as I said, as you asked to have your book as the first book because it makes sense with the other books in the series.
Yeah.
We'll start with your book, which is The Jews of Lithuania by Nick Sayers. I think it's actually, is it down as Nicholas Sayers? I changed it to make it the same as your name here, but if anybody wants to buy it on Amazon, I think
it's normally Nick Sayers, yes.
Yes.
That's formal, yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Tim. I mean, I should perhaps begin by saying that I spent my working life as a lawyer.
Yeah.
I was a corporate transaction lawyer in firms in the City of London, doing mergers and acquisitions and fundraisings for businesses, which is a very intense kind of work. People sort of go into a meeting and they come out of the same meeting literally 2 or 3 days and nights later. So it is very intense. And I always knew that I would need to retire from that, in my early 60s. So as a way of preparing for the next stage of my life, I decided to do a master's Birkbeck to give me the techniques of historical research. And leading on from that, I decided to try and write a book about the paternal side of my family and their kind of wider history. But my book is not really family history. I'm not particularly interested in family history. I think family history could be of some interest to the immediate family, but tends not to be of much wider interest. So the idea was, and it's perhaps a slightly unusual idea, but the idea was just to look at the outline of the experience of the paternal line of the family and use that as a way of choosing some of the wider historical subjects to write about. So to try and put that in a slightly easier context, my great-grandfather was born and brought up in northern Lithuania in a tiny village, which actually I have been to. It's in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a very dense forest, tiny place. And he migrated from there in the late 19th century to Cork in Southern Ireland. And he stayed there for a period of time. And then they migrated again from Cork to Dublin. My grandfather trained as a doctor in Dublin and then moved in the 1920s to London. So that's the outline of the family experience on the paternal side of the family. So using that outline, what I've done in the book is to ask some wider historical questions about the sort of life that my great-grandfather might have led in Lithuania. So some of the questions I look at are things like, what was life like for Jewish people living in Lithuania in the late 19th century? Was it becoming more difficult? And if so, why was that? Why did people migrate? And how did they choose where to go? And how exactly did they go there? And why did anybody choose to go to Ireland, perhaps a slightly unlikely place to choose to go when so many people were actually leaving Ireland at that time? And then the book goes on to think about what happened to Jewish people who stayed behind in Lithuania during the First World War, during the interwar years. And then it considers how and why the Holocaust happened in Lithuania, and indeed how our Lithuanian government and society has tried or not tried to come to terms with the Holocaust and the way that it developed in Lithuania. So those are the broad themes that the book covers.
So is it fiction or non-fiction, or is it kind of a mix of like?
No, it's not fiction at all. It is. Yeah. It's intended to be a work of history.
Oh, okay. It's proper kind of.
It's a history book. I mean, I guess anybody writing a history book has got to decide who is the audience. I mean, I suppose a good question for anybody writing any book is, who am I actually writing it for? Who is the audience for this book? And in writing a sort of, if you like, a reasonably serious work of history, I think you have a choice. Either you are aiming at an academic audience, or you are aiming at what you might call the intelligent general reader.
Yeah.
And I mean, because I was not a history academic during my working life. I mean, I wrote history as an undergraduate, but I was not a history academic. I thought it was not appropriate, really, to try and aim the book at history academics. But I did want the book to be respected by an academic audience. But it's aimed at the intelligent general reader, as I've described them. And, although at one level the book, perhaps concerns quite a sort of narrow subject, the background of a family in some tiny and very out of the way little place in northern Lithuania. At another level, I think the book does open questions of much wider interest in world history. I mean, it is connected to World War, to migration, to Holocaust. I mean, these are some of the big subjects of modern European history.
Well, Lithuania especially, because I think wasn't Lithuania in the part that was basically in the Ribbentrop Pact, which was given to the Soviet Union before, and then it was basically again taken back and
yes. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there was a year between summer of 1940, 1941, when Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union. And then the Germans invaded in summer 1941, and the Soviets withdrew, and it was under German occupation from 1941 until the end of the war. So you're absolutely right. There was a year when Lithuania was under Soviet occupation. I mean, it might be worth my just quickly sketching the outline of the history of Lithuania. I think a lot of people don't quite realize this, that for a long period of time in the sort of early modern period, Lithuania was a part of the so-called Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which occupied a great swathe of territory in Central and Eastern Europe, which would now be Poland, Lithuania, but also Ukraine and Belarus. It was a huge area. But in the course of the 19th century, or in fact, in the course of the late 18th century, Poland was partitioned between the Russians, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Prussians. And from the late 19th century, from the late 18th century, from the third partition of Poland in 1795, Poland, that part of Lithuania, became controlled by Russia. And that was a big turning point for the Jewish community of Lithuania, because before then, they'd had great control over their own affairs, lots of autonomy, and life had been reasonably good for them. I mean, actually, Jewish people had tended to have a very difficult time in other Western European countries in medieval period and in the early modern period. Indeed, they were expelled at different times from most Western European countries, including, of course, from England in 1290. Yeah. But they had found refuge in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they had been able to have great autonomy over their own affairs. But that position became much more difficult after Russia took control of Lithuania in the late 18th century, from 1795 onwards. From that time, the fate of Jews tended to depend on the attitude of the Tsar. And the Tsars were invariably autocratic, and most of them are not very well disposed towards Jewish people. So from 1795 onwards, life became much more difficult.
Yeah. So what was the most surprising thing that you discovered while writing this book?
I mean, there were lots of things that I found quite surprising. I mean, let me see. Well, I suppose one thing I really didn't previously know anything about was what happened to the Jewish community in Lithuania during the First World War.
Yeah.
Because what happened was that in May 1915, the Russians became concerned that Jewish people in Lithuania might act as spies and pass important intelligence information to the Germans. So they exiled the Jewish community almost one day to the next, deep into Russia. And they were spread across all sorts of different areas in the fairly remote parts of what was then the Soviet Union. Sorry, it wasn't the Soviet Union, it was in Russia. And I didn't think I really knew much about that before I researched the book.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was an important moment because it really kind of brought to an end the sort of Jewish communities that had lived in these small places for centuries. I mean, they had lived there in some cases, for several hundred years. So that exile into deep Russia in 1915 was difficult. And then at the end of the First World War, they tried to get back into Lithuania, but it was difficult because they often got caught up in the civil war in Russia between the Whites and the Reds, as it was called, and indeed also the war between Russia and Poland, which was very dirty and ugly and lots of pogroms at that time. So it became very difficult for Jewish people to get back to Lithuania. And when they did come back to Lithuania, they tended to go mainly to the larger towns, particularly to Kaunas. Actually, Vilnius, now the capital, was, after the First World War, part of Poland, not of Lithuania.
Oh.
So they did not go back there, but they went to Kaunas for the most part. But I think it was that exile of 1915 that brought to an end, really, the long connection of many Jewish people with these small villages in different parts of Lithuania.
Right. Well, that's your book. Shall we talk about the next book in the thing?
Well, yes. Okay. So, as I said when we started, I chose books that, in a way, connect to some of the overarching themes of my book. The first book I chose, which is, I think probably quite a known book, was by the author Sholem Aleichem, and it's called Tevye the Milkman, or Tevye the Dairyman. And this is the book on which the famous film and play Fiddler on the Roof is based. I chose this because I think it's actually quite a good description of what Jewish life was like in these small, remote places at the end of the 19th century. But I also came to the view that at one level, the lifestyle was, appeared very old-fashioned. You could say almost fossilized. But at another level, change was happening.
Yeah.
And I think the change was coming about, for two main reasons, actually. One was that the sort of Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, as it was called, the Jewish Enlightenment was beginning to affect Jewish people in these smaller communities, in that they were able to get hold of books and to read them, and this changed their outlook, widened their outlook, made it possible for them to participate in kind of wider European culture. So I think this life was changing, it was modernizing because of this influence. The other thing I think that was happening and causing this change was that a lot of these small villages, including the one that my great-grandfather came from, was not very far from some of the Baltic ports.
Yeah.
And the Baltic ports were often strongly German influenced and gave access to a wider world of learning and culture. And at the end of the 19th century, the railways were installed, so it became possible for people to move around this area a bit, to get to the ports and to move around more easily. I mean, Sholem Aleichem's book, Tevye the Dairyman, is a kind of brilliant description of that world, which is now a completely lost world, as it was changing. And you see this, I think, really in the wonderful film Fiddler on the Roof. I mean, at one level, it is a picture of a very, old-fashioned village. On the other hand, it is a village that is being affected by change. I mean, one of the great themes of the book and the film is the way that Tevye is not able to control the behavior of his daughters. I mean, they kind of want to go off and marry who they want to marry, and he's not able to decide that they will just marry the person that he regards as being suitable for them to marry. And indeed, some of them do things that I think early generations would have found, completely unacceptable. I mean, one of them, I think, goes off with a revolutionary who gets exiled deep into Russia. Another daughter marries somebody who's not Jewish, and so he has to try and cope with a rapidly changing world. So it's a wonderful book, I think.
Because I don't know when the film Fiddler on the Roof was made. Was it like the 1960s or something?
I think 50s? It was the 1970s, actually. 70s. Yeah.
Presumably, at the time, they probably had to change the title to be more kind of Hollywood, I guess.
Yes. I mean, it was obviously intended, to reach a wide audience, and indeed it did. I think it was a hugely successful film, and it continues to be shown, and the play continues to be shown quite often. Yeah.
Okay, right. We go to the next one, which is World of Our Fathers by Irving, Howe.
Okay, well, the World of Our Fathers is a slightly different book. It's not a work of fiction. It's a work of history. Yeah. It's quite a well-known book. It came out in the 1970s by an American historian, and I think it became regarded as one of the main works which described the process of Jewish migration from Eastern Europe to the New World, particularly to America. Okay. And I mean, that is a topic that I look at in my own book. I mean, Irving Howe goes into it in a sense more deeply than I do. And he's also very concerned with some of the migration that took place once people had got to the East Coast cities, particularly New York. Yeah. He goes on to consider the sort of onward migration from New York to other cities in the US. And obviously, I don't go there in my book. But the question of sort of why so many people did migrate and how they chose where to go, I mean, I think is actually a fascinating question, and one with wide resonances for other communities who've moved around the world. I mean, I think in the case of the Jews who migrated from northern Lithuania, I mean, for quite a long time, historians thought that the principal reason for their migration was the pogroms, that they were the victims of violence. Actually, people who've looked at this closely recently, I think, have come to the conclusion that there were not that many pogroms in Lithuania itself. Most of the pogroms of the late 19th century were actually further south. So I think people were fleeing not so much the pogroms, but actually rather the fear that pogroms might come to them. There were some pogroms, but I think the fear that they might affect you was something that was very uppermost in people's minds. So there was that. I think also that under the Tsarist governments of the late 19th century, there were an extraordinary range of different laws which were deliberately discriminatory against Jewish people. Yeah. At the end of the 19th century, there was something called the Phelan Commission, which was established to sort of look into the Jewish condition in late 19th century Russia, and it identified an extraordinary 650 different laws which were deliberately and specifically targeted against Jewish people, which affected where they could live, what kind of occupations they could be involved with, and it made their lives almost impossible. So I think trying to escape from those very difficult restrictions was a significant motivation for people's migration. And I think another reason for people migrating was that they were keen to avoid being conscripted into the Tsarist army, because in the mid-19th century, there had been a policy of for Jewish people to have to serve in the Tsarist army for 25 years. Young boys of sort of, 8, 10, 12, sent into deep Russia. I mean, it was basically a mechanism to try and force the baptism of these people. Actually, by the late 19th century, when most of the migration took place, that the period of conscription was shorter, and I think the kind of worst excesses of the conscription were behind one. But nonetheless, I think fear of being conscripted into the Tsarist army remained a significant motivation for the migration of quite a lot of people. I think the other thing that is important to say about this migration is that at that time, you could go to America and to European countries. You didn't need a passport to get in. You were supposed to have a Russian passport to get out of Russia, but you didn't need a passport to get into the UK or into America. You could just go if you could get there. So that it was, in a sense, easier to migrate. That situation changed with the First World War when migration controls came in. And from that time onwards, you see somewhat fewer people going to America and to Britain, and more Lithuanian Jews went to South Africa, actually, in interwar period.
Yeah. So it's like this, but this book in particular is about Jewish migration all around the world. Is it just migration, or is it Jewish migration?
It's really about Jewish migration from Eastern Europe to America.
Oh, okay. So expansive, but compared to your book, anyway.
About 75% of those who migrated went to America. So it considers in great depth the various sort of motivations for migration and the experience of Jewish people living, particularly on the Lower East Side in New York, and then how, when, and why they moved on from there, both to the suburbs of New York, but also to other cities across America, and how they settled in and so on. I mean, one thing I might just touch on that was in my book, I talk about this quite a bit, is sort of why people went to Ireland, because of course, Ireland is, I mean, perhaps it wasn't a very obvious place to choose to migrate to, given that so many people had left Ireland in the course of the 19th century. And I mean, I think the historians who looked at this think that there's a question about whether people deliberately chose to go to Ireland, whether, on the other hand, it was kind of a mistake. But now, when I say mistake, I mean that some people think that Jews were missold tickets. They thought they were buying a ticket for America, but actually it was only to get them as far as Ireland.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes people just could not bear being seasick on the Baltic and sort of just had to get off the boat as soon as they reasonably could. Sometimes people's supplies of kosher food ran out, so they simply got off the boat when they could. But I mean, a whole series of, shall we say, stories or jokes or I think contain a degree of truth developed as to how and why it was that this Jewish community in Ireland developed. And one of the classic stories that was told in my family was that people coming on the boat, who at that point did not speak English, of course, heard the ship's captain say we're coming into Cork, and they heard Ork and thought, oh, this must be New York. So they got off the wrong place. So that was one story. And another story I heard quite recently from a distant cousin of mine was that in his family, as he was leaving Lithuania, a family relative gave him a gold coin and said to him, now you should get off the boat when you see a statue. And the boat that he was on came into Cork, went up the River Lee, where there was then a statue of Queen Victoria. And he looked at this and thought, oh, well, it must be Statue of Liberty. And so got off the boat at the wrong place. So, I mean, I don't really know whether these stories are actually true. They may have been, but I think they any way indicate that there was a considerable degree of chance about people ending up in Ireland.
Okay. Right. Shall we go on to the next book, which
Sure.
is 1920 Diary by Isaac Babel. So,
Yes. Well, I think the first two books I mentioned are kind of very well-known books. This one is perhaps a bit less well-known. Isaac Babel was a man who grew up in Odessa on the Black Sea, and he kept a diary of his experiences at the end of the First World War, when there was terrible civil war in Russia between the Reds, the people who supported the Bolshevik Revolution on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Whites, the people who I suppose wanted Tsarist government to continue. And that civil war sort of went on kind of alongside the war between Russia and Poland at the end of the First World War, when Poland sought to regain its independence. And I think on the Russian side, there was a kind of expectation that across Europe, people would sort of welcome the idea of workers being in control of political affairs. So they would just need to go into some of these Western European countries and people would welcome them with open arms. The Poles, on the other hand, saw the end of the First World War as an opportunity to prize themselves free of Russian control and to reassert their independence. So there was a terrible war between Russia and Poland. This diary is kind of describes the experiences of Isaac Babel, who attached himself to a sort of Bolshevik military unit, and he was with them as they fought the Whites and fought the Poles. And it is a terrible description of the chaos and the horrors that continued beyond the end of the First World War. Yeah. And again, I think this is not something that is sort of that well known in England. I mean, I think that when people think of the First World War, they tend, don't they, to think of the Western Front and the terrible battles, trenches. But there was also this war on the Eastern Front, which extended beyond 1918 and was, very difficult. And so, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the Jewish people in Lithuania had been forcibly expelled from Lithuania, so they found themselves in Ukraine and in Poland, and therefore unwillingly caught up in this civil war and the war between Poland and Russia, which Babel describes. Babel was Jewish, but he kept a very low profile about it. So I think a lot of the people with whom he served in the Bolshevik army didn't realize that he was. His views are interesting, and that his basic outlook is to be, sympathetic to the aspirations of the new communist government in Russia. But the unit that he served with was largely made up of Cossacks, because the Bolsheviks did sort of use the services of a lot of Cossacks because they were very effective fighters. And I think I think Babel became appalled, even traumatized, at seeing the terrible violence generally, but violence particularly against Jewish people all around him, and violence that was perpetrated as much by the Bolshevik armies as it was by the armies of the Whites.
Yeah. I mean, the Russian Civil War, I think it went on to was it 1922 or something? Went on, went on a long time.
It did, yeah.
Like on YouTube, I'm following this guy does this basic animated maps of things. And he's doing an animated map at the moment of the Russian Civil War. And it looked for a long time like the communists were going to lose, but for whatever reason, they managed to actually kind of win it. But it was a terrible, one of the great untold terrible wars of history, I think.
Yes, it was a terrible war, and I mean, I think there was a time when some of the Western governments thought about intervening. I think Churchill, well, I don't know about a favour, but he was certainly highly tempted to intervene against the Bolsheviks in Russia, but was persuaded not to do that. But as I say, there was terrible violence that accompanied these wars, and there's quite a sort of debate among some historians about whether the violence that erupted, particularly against Jewish people at that time, then sort of got carried forward into what happened in the Holocaust. And I think there's no doubt that, some of the sort of horrors that people witnessed sort of influenced them and, in a way made it easier for people to participate in horrors about 20 years later.
Yeah. Yeah, I think actually wasn't Stalin one of the generals on that particular border between like Poland and Russia, which apparently is one of the reasons why the Russians lost in terms of.
Yeah, I think he was, yes.
Yeah.
Particularly and he obviously didn't turn out particularly well as a leader in terms of human rights. Right. Shall we go on to the next book?
Okay. Well, the next book, perhaps I shouldn't have had this book right next to the other one, because this book, in my own book, I do talk about how and why the Holocaust happened in Lithuania. And just perhaps to say one or two things about that. I won't talk a lot about the Holocaust, but just one or two brief words about it. I think Lithuania was the first European country in which there was an intention to destroy the entire Jewish community. And it was largely successful. About 96% of the pre-war Jewish community was killed in the Holocaust in Lithuania. And this was very different from the Holocaust in other parts of Central Europe, in that it was not Holocaust by gas van or by gas chamber. It was by shooting people. Yeah. So the people died by being shot. And the people that shot them were Lithuanians. Usually, but not always, there were a few Germans in the background, but the people that actually carried out the mass executions right the way across Lithuania were ethnic Lithuanians. I think that's not very well known. And actually, it's not very well known even today among Lithuanians, because there's been a bit of a wall of silence for a long period in the post-war world. I think now a number of younger Lithuanians are being better educated about it, and it's more coming into focus. But for a long time, I think younger people didn't really know very much about this. So the book that I've chosen here, Rivka Lozansky Bogomolnaya's Wartime Experiences in Lithuania, is I think a remarkable book. It's a book she wrote when she was quite an old lady. So kind of 40, 50 years after the Holocaust. But she was a witness to the Holocaust in Lithuania. Her family were all shot. She managed to survive by sort of hiding in the forests. But she describes very accurately and clearly what she saw. And this is unusual because, as I say, the vast majority of Lithuanian Jews were killed and were therefore unable to provide evidence or witness evidence for what they experienced. Most of the small handful of Jewish people who actually survived the war did so by in one of two or three ways. Some survived by fleeing east into the Soviet Union, which was quite difficult to do because the Lithuanians had been persuaded by the Germans to try to stop Jewish people from fleeing east into the Soviet Union, but nonetheless, some did. A small handful of people who had been involved in the Soviet administration of Lithuania in the year of Soviet occupation between some of 1940 and 1941 were actually deported into the Soviet Union by the Soviets just to 2 or 3 days before the German invasion. So those people were extremely fortunate, and they did survive, some of them. So other Jewish people survived by fleeing to the woods and being with the partisans, but that wasn't very easy because they tended to flee with family members, particularly young children, and that was not easy. And some survived just by hiding in so-called malines, which were sort of sewers generally under towns, but very few survived in that way. So, as I say, kind of most of the Jewish community was shot. And this memoir by Rivka is an extraordinary first-hand account. And most unusually, she decided to stay in Lithuania post-war because, generally speaking, when Jewish people came back to Lithuania post-war, they did not stay there. I mean, their lives had been wiped out. I mean, family members, or kind of most family members, were gone, and they found it extremely depressing and difficult to stay there. So most of them moved on very quickly. And it's not entirely clear why she did this, but Rivka did decide to stay in Lithuania. I think partly because she wanted to put the mass graves into some decent order. Yeah. She was very distressed by the fact that some of the graves had just a little soil over them, and the animals would come take the bodies away and so on. So she wanted to put the mass graves in order, and she also thought that she would like to try and do something to bring some of the perpetrators to justice. Her efforts in that regard were almost entirely without success. Yeah. But, she vividly describes the experience of trying to continue to live in Lithuania, but seeing all around her people who she'd known all her life who would ignore her as they walked by. And she would see these people wearing clothes that had belonged to her family members. I mean, extremely traumatic. And in fact, she found at one point that she was living in the same block of flats as somebody she knew had been involved in killing members of her family. So it was extremely difficult to stay in Lithuania post-war, and it was extremely unusual for her to do so. I have to say, it's not totally clear to me exactly why she did. As I say, I think it was partly to try to put the mass graves in order, and partly to try to bring some of the perpetrators to justice. But it's a remarkable account. So, and I think rather unusual because, as I say, there are very few accounts really exactly what happened. And I'm sorry if this sounds a very bleak topic. I'm just getting away from the fact that, it is a very difficult subject. But at the same time, I mean, I think it is, it was a terrible event, and it's important that there should be evidence of that.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, certainly in the current world, there's lots of cases of history being airbrushed into particular things. And I mean, just in general in the Second World War, I mean, a lot of the German, quote, forces that invaded the Soviet Union were not German. They were from other places like Romania and Italy. Yeah. But mysteriously, everybody forgets about those people in the Axis Union. And there were lots of things that were kind of conveniently forgotten about when the Cold War happened.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I suppose in England, there's entirely understandably a tendency for us to focus on aspects of the Second World War that particularly affected England. Yeah. And I think our understanding of what happened in Eastern Europe has been particularly difficult because, in the Soviet period, it was almost impossible for people from the West to go to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union tended to describe what had happened in Eastern Europe in their own ideological terms. So they tended not to refer to Jewish people being killed because they were Jews, but instead to people being killed because they belonged to a particular socioeconomic class, and the people killed are described as Soviet citizens. In fact, even now there are many mass graves in Lithuania that talk, where the information about the people buried there talks about them being Soviet citizens, not about them being Jews who were killed because they were Jewish. So I think the fact that that whole area was controlled by the Soviet Union for such a long period of time made it quite difficult for people really to understand clearly what had happened. That position did change a bit when Lithuania became independent, because in the context of trying to join the EU and NATO, it needed to do a number of different things. It needed to educate its young people. It needed to put up Holocaust memorials. It needed to try and do something to bring to justice some of the perpetrators, etc. I mean, I think a lot of people feel they haven't done very much in the direction of doing those things, but they've made some effort to do so. So I think that, in the more recent past, people have begun to understand what happened better.
Yeah.
And I think also finally that actually quite a lot of people in the West, when they think about the Holocaust, think about the Auschwitz experience, and that tended to rather sort of dominate and overshadow what happened a bit before Auschwitz became fully operational. When, as I say, there was this kind of Holocaust by bullets, as it's called.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not meaning to get down this macabre path, but I will anyway. Like, the reason they called it like the final solution, like Auschwitz, was because they tried the earlier solutions in places like Lithuania, just shooting everybody, and it was like, well, this is going to take too long, so let's do it even more industrialised.
Yes. Well, I think it was an attempt to industrialise the murder process, and I think that there was a feeling that it was traumatic for the shooters to do the shooting.
Yeah.
And it was certainly in Lithuania, it was often the case that people doing the shooting fill themselves up with vodka both before and after the shooting, so as to better to cope with the awful experience.
Okay, should we go to the next book? Which is...
Well, the next one is a book by a woman called Silvia Foti, and it's called The Nazi's Granddaughter. Silvia Foti was an American journalist. She was brought up in Chicago, in part of Chicago where there was a large Lithuanian community, not a Jewish community, a Lithuanian community, ethnic Lithuanian community. And she was the granddaughter of someone called General Noreika, who was known as General Storm. And she had been brought up to think that he was a tremendous hero, because in the immediate post-war world, he had tried to lead a rebellion against Soviet occupation to reassert Lithuanian independence and if he could, to throw the Soviets out.
Yeah.
And he was idolized by many, many people in the area of Chicago where she was brought up. Noreika's daughter, which is to say Silvia's mother, had spent many years of her life trying to write a book about Noreika, but she hadn't been able to finish it. And on her deathbed, she spoke to Silvia and sort of more or less made Silvia agree that she would finish this book that she had started. So Silvia tried to do this. And in the course of doing it, she traveled to Lithuania and quite extensively went around Lithuania, visited it, and began to talk to various people. And as she did that, she just sort of began to get the sense that there was a bit more to Noreika than she had been told when she was being brought up. And she came to understand from various conversations and researches that she conducted that Noreika had actually been, well, first of all, she discovered that Noreika, when he was a young man in the 1920s, had written a number of papers that were sort of viciously anti-Semitic. And then she also came to realize that during the wartime years, Noreika had responsibility for shooting of large numbers of Jews in northern Lithuania. And I mean, Silvia Foti wasn't really quite sure of the exact numbers. I mean, she thought there might be something of the order of 8,000 to 10,000 people who had been murdered, really on the say-so of her grandfather. And to her immense credit, I think Silvia Foti, she was completely appalled by this. It was an extremely traumatic discovery for her. But she became absolutely determined to write the true story. She also, I think, came to think that his attempt to overthrow the Soviet regime in the immediate post-war period was crazy. I mean, it was never going to work. It was just an act of foolishness, and she became rather contemptuous of what all her contemporaries and parents and their friends had thought of as a wonderfully heroic act. So she decided, after she had uncovered the truth about Noreka's wartime experiences, to go round Lithuania and very carefully look at a lot of the mass graves and talk to people and really deeply try and understand what had happened. And she wrote this book, The Nazi's Granddaughter, which describes this whole journey that she took. And it's a very powerful book, and not least because it also describes the hostility which she encountered both within her own family, but more particularly within a lot of the Lithuanian world, who I think were bound to a bit of a traitor, so to speak, to be portraying the man that many of them are considered a great hero. Indeed, when she first went there, I mean, there were schools named after him. There were statues of Noreka in a number of places in Lithuania. I mean, he was a famous person and widely regarded as a hero. And so she encountered considerable hostility when she dished the dirt on him, so to speak.
In history, there's been a lot of cases of famous people who have maybe not famous for one thing, but admitting the very bad things they've done. So.
That's true. But I suppose it's very difficult when that is in your own family. And it was clearly very traumatic for her, but she was absolutely determined that the right thing was to tell the truth as she saw it.
Yeah. Okay, should we go on to the next book, which I think is the final one?
The final book,
Ulysses by James Joyce, which I have heard of. Yeah.
Of course, a very famous book, and a famous, perhaps above all, for being an extremely difficult book. I mean, a lot of people think of James Joyce's Ulysses as the classic work of 20th century modernist fiction. But it's often said that a lot of people start it and many fewer actually finish it. It is a difficult book. The reason I've put it on my list is that it is sort of fundamentally a book about a Jewish person in Dublin on one particular day. Yeah. And so the thing that's kind of interesting about it is that Joyce, I think, uses the experience of Leopold Bloom as a kind of metaphor for the deracinated condition of modern man. But what is intriguing about the book, in a way, if you look at it from the sort of Jewish angle, is that actually Joyce wrote this book not in Ireland, but when he was living in Trieste in what's now in northern Italy in the interwar period, the 1920s. Trieste is a port. It had been the main port for Vienna, and had quite a substantial Jewish community. But the Jews there were actually very different kinds of people from the people that were living in Dublin. Joyce seems to have been particularly close to somebody called Italo Svevo, who was also a writer and was Jewish. And I think perhaps what happened was that Joyce sort of took his experiences of people that he knew in Trieste and rather transposed them back onto Jewish people in Dublin. And he had this sort of phone directory which had the names and occupations of a number of Jewish people living in Dublin. And he sort of transposed this on to them. But at the same time, I think the book does provide, sort of quite interesting insights into Jewish life in Ireland in the early 20th century. And actually, that is the subject of my next book that I'm currently working on at the moment. So I think a lot of people find Ulysses a very difficult book.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, my advice to anybody thinking about reading it is that actually there are these so-called guides to the book, and if you read the book alongside a guide, I think it is much easier to understand what's going on. And I can only say that I think it's very much sort of worth the effort, because it's kind of endlessly fascinating. And as I say, it does describe various aspects of Jewish life in early 20th century Ireland, including how Jewish people first earned a living, which was mainly by peddling. So they would sort of have goods on their back. They would go out into the countryside, sell things, usually on credit, to Irish housewives. And Joyce describes all of that quite well. He also describes some of the sort of, she would say, hostility that some Jewish people encountered. I mean, it was all at that time, Ireland was often thought of as a place that was comparatively welcoming to Jewish people, but I think Joyce doesn't entirely disagree with that. But it's clear from the attitudes of some of the characters in the book that they are not well disposed to Jewish people, and the main Jewish character, Leopold Bloom, has some difficult encounters. So it's an interesting insight into that as well. But it's a wonderful book. I know many people have spent their lives reading it again and again and find it fascinating. But I know also that many people find it very difficult. So for those that do, use a guide is my advice.
Well, it's like with anything. I mean, I remember trying to read it years ago, and I think I got to about chapter 2. But it's a very kind of literary and almost poetic book in many ways.
It is. I mean, but I think it's worth persisting with, because those people that really know about these things, great literary critics, invariably say that it is one of the great, if not the great novel of the 20th century. I mean, it's worth persisting with.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you already kind of answered one of my questions that I asked at the end, but I will ask you the first question, which actually, in this case, is a bit weird. But if you met somebody and you had to recommend one of these books to them, what kind of questions would you ask them? Like, what would be the flow chart of questions to work out which of these books to give them? Just a person somewhere.
Well, I suppose the answer to that would depend on what kind of person they were and what kind of book they wanted to read. Because, I mean, some of the books, in particular Ulysses, I mean, challenging by any standard. So I suppose the first question perhaps is, do they want to read a work of fiction or a work of history? If they wanted to read a work of fiction, if they want something that's sort of quite easy but also quite insightful, I would certainly recommend the Sholem Aleichem's Tevye, the Milkman. But if they want to, if they would find it rewarding to try and come to terms with one of the great books of the 20th century, or was a difficult one, then I would say, why don't they try Ulysses? If on the other hand they want a history book, then I suppose it's a question of which sort of particular aspect of 20th century history they want to focus on. If they're interested in the experience of migration, I think they would find the Irving Howe, The World of Our Fathers, very rewarding. If on the other hand, they want to look at, well, I suppose more of an original memoir about what the Eastern European world was like after the First World War, then Isaac Babel's 1920 diary would be very interesting. And if they're interested in something that in a way is a bit of an overlap between modern history and politics, but also memoir, then I would strongly recommend Silvia Foti's book. And of course, I would also recommend my own book.
Because, don't forget that. Yeah.
And I think, my own book is designed to cover a number of these subjects, and it's designed to be quite accessible. So I hope it is.
Okay, well, that's the first question I ask everybody. And the second question you kind of already mentioned the answer to, which is, what have you got coming up? What's the next book you're working on?
Okay, well, thank you for asking that. The answer is that, taking the overarching theme of looking at the experience of the paternal line of my family, I think I already mentioned that my great-grandfather moved from northern Lithuania to southern Ireland in about 1890. So my second book continues this, slightly eccentric technique, if you like, of choosing the outline of the experience of the family to choose a particular historical subject to write about, and looks at the Jewish experience in Ireland. So it looks at the questions like, why did Jewish people go to Ireland? Was it accident, or was it a question of choice? And I've really touched on that, I think. It looks about the questions of how Jewish people first earned a living in Ireland, and the answer was mainly by peddling. But it also looks at how people were able to transition so quickly from being peddlers to having more sort of middle class activities, because I think it is interesting that within a generation people had moved from being peddlers to being doctors. So how is that possible? And my kind of answer to that really is that I think the Jews from Lithuania had a very particular respect for learning and a very particular approach to learning, which was that they respected the religious texts. They studied them very carefully. People were encouraged to have their own views about them and to articulate their own views. And so they became very mentally agile. And those skills could then be translated quite quickly, from being a peddler to being a lawyer or a doctor or an academic. So look at that. And then I look at sort of how Jewish people in Ireland navigated the sectarian conflict they saw going on around them. They tend to side with the Irish Catholic side or the Anglo-Protestant side. How did they navigate that? And the answers are quite complicated, but it's quite interesting. I also look at the questions about how Jewish nationalism and Irish nationalism sort of interacted, tried to learn from each other, which I think they did. I think that a lot of the Irish nationalists were very interested in the way that the Jewish nationalists had been able to revive an ancient language, Hebrew, and they looked at whether it might be possible to revive Gaelic in a similar way, try to do so, taking advantage of the Jewish experience. But I think they were less successful at it. But I think, sort of both Ireland and Palestine, as it then was, were, sort of on the margins of the British European Empire, so to speak. And just before the Second World War, a number of Zionist leaders came to Ireland, particularly Jabotinsky, to try and learn lessons about how one might be able to drive oneself away from British control. So I look at all that, and then I look at the sort of Jewish experience in Ireland during the Second World War, and particularly the reluctance of Ireland to admit many Jewish people. There was only about 60 Jewish people were admitted to Ireland during the Second World War. well, of course, their fate was fairly desperate, and many more than that sought admission to Ireland. And then I also look at on the process of emigration from Ireland in the post-war period, why Jewish people left. And I think it was partly that they were seeking marital partners, they were seeking sort of better business opportunities. Some, of course, stayed, but the Jewish population of Ireland at its peak was about 5,000, and it's now down to, well, nobody knows exactly, but about 2,500, something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I went to Belfast last year and I did this sort of taxi tour of Belfast. And there's still like Catholic and Protestant communities. But what's funny is that a lot of the murals are now, the Catholic side is associated with the Palestinian cause, and the Protestant side is with the Israeli side. It's almost like flipped totally round from what it was before, by the sounds of things.
I know, it's very. I mean, it's very intriguing and curious. This, there is clearly great identification in Catholic Ireland with the Palestinian cause. I mean, I've actually quite recently been in Southern Ireland, and you go around these sort of tiny places on the west coast of Ireland, and wherever you go, there are Palestinian flags, and one's being encouraged to go on marches. And you know, how can I say, I think historical parallels are always difficult, but it's curious to me that people in Ireland should see a sort of close parallel between the Irish Catholic experience and the Palestinian Arab experience, and actually sort of particularly curious in a way, in that, you know, until, well, it's difficult to date exactly, but sometime in the post-war period, perhaps say about 1967, until then, you know, the Catholics had been really quite supportive of Jews. But as you say, it's flipped, and I think there is this idea of sort of Jews in Israel being equivalent to English settlers in Ireland, colonials. But I think perhaps it's a bit more complicated than that.
Well, that's the truth. I mean, that was the problem with the Irish situation, but it was more complicated than that, and it's now true with the Middle Eastern situation.
Yeah.
Okay. It's been great to talk to you. Before we leave, can you tell people how to find out about you and how to buy your book, and if there's anything else that you want to promote or talk about?
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Yes. Well, I have a website which has some more about my book and about me, nicksayers.co.uk. And you can get the book on Amazon. It's called The Jews of Lithuania, A Journey Through the Long 20th Century. And actually, on my website, there is a recording of a talk I gave about the book. So you could see that. As I say, I'm currently working on my next book about the modern history of the Jews of Ireland, which I think won't be published for a bit, but I hope will come out at the end of 2026 or perhaps early 2027. Use the approach that I've taken with the first book. But thank you very much indeed for hosting me, Tim. It's been very good to talk to you, and thank you.
Well, and thanks to everybody who's been watching on Amazon, and thanks in advance to people who watch on YouTube, hoping they don't block it because of all the talk about certain issues in the Second World War. But hopefully be fine uploading it. I might have to cut those bits. So thanks to everybody watching.